everyone, welcome to today's session all about supporting learners with dyslexia through practical tips, tools and strategies. My name is Bethan Coffey. I was a former secondary English teacher for 8 years and head of GCSE, and I am now with Everway as a business development executive. Today I am joined by two experts in the field. We have Frances Akinde, who is a seasoned educational consultant and former SENCO, and we have Dr. Shae Marie Wissell, who is a speech and language pathologist with a deep focus on dyslexia. Now, before we begin, ladies, sorry, I've kind of got carried away with the introductions. Could you please tell us a little bit more about your background and what drives you to work in this particular area?
Okay, would you like me to go first?
Yes, please, Frances.
Okay, hi, my name is Frances Akinde. Thank you so much for that introduction. I am an education consultant specializing in supporting children with special needs, a former art teacher, and that's really important in terms of that visual element. I work across supporting local authorities, to make sure that they're fully inclusive. And I'm also an author of the book Be an Ally, Not a Bystander, which is around anti-discrimination, advocacy, and anti-bullying in schools.
And hi, I'm Shae, and I'm based in Melbourne in Australia. My background is in speech pathology, but I was diagnosed with dyslexia and dysgraphia when I was 27. And that really sent me on a journey of self-discovery, but also a realization that there's really a lack of understanding and support for young people and adults in Australia around dyslexia and what that means as we transition out of school into adulthood. And I'm also a researcher, so I've published a number of research papers looking at adulthood dyslexia, and also, like Frances, have written a book, but mine's based on my thesis, and I've turned it into a practical resource for families, those with dyslexia, and people working to support them across education, employment and policymakers as well.
Thank you for that. Thank you to both of you. It's wonderful to have you here. I'm honestly so excited to begin this discussion. It's not every day, a teacher from Scotland gets to speak to two experts about this type of topics. I'm really excited to get started. Now, before we go on to the different tools and strategies, what I think is really important, and I know we've had this discussion previous to this, is understanding essentially why it is so important to address this inclusion topic around dyslexia, making sure that every individual learner is having their needs met. And I suppose that's why we are listening to this session today, because like us three, we want to make a change and we want to make sure that every individual person is getting the chances that they can in life. So let's just talk a little bit about some statistics. So 10% of the global population have dyslexia. That is 6.9 million people in the UK and 2.7 million Australians. Now that is a staggering amount of people, and I'm going to be a little bit controversial here, and I'm going to say that I actually don't believe that that is the most accurate statistic out there. A little personal anecdote for myself is I have two older sisters that have dyslexia, and my eldest sister was only showing, I suppose, signs through university in her last year, her fourth year at university, where she then got a diagnostic. And I suppose that then created this chain ball effect where my other sister, who had just started high school, she then went through her statement too. And I now see my mother, who's now retired, there's no need for her to get a statement or a diagnosis, or she feels that way. She definitely expresses signs of having dyslexia herself. And I suppose that's why I think that there's definitely some skewing with the numbers here, that we can't know for sure how many people within the UK, Australia and New Zealand have dyslexia. Just like my mother, so many people kind of fall through those gaps, and they don't seem in their retirement essential to go through that diagnosis again. And I think that it's really important as educators. Say I was teaching and I teach 6 lessons a day and there's 32 pupils in my classroom. I know the support needs for all of those learners in my classroom if they have a statement. I try and get to know every single individual pupil and their different needs, their different learning styles, and meet those needs. But I hate to say it, the expectation is we only meet those needs of those children if they have a statement. How many children don't have these statements? How many children have different learning needs? And I think when we're talking about this and all these tools and strategies, I'm sure you both agree it's important that when we're going through this, it doesn't have to only apply with those children with a statement. It can apply to any learner, who those particular strategies really benefit from those needs, especially if there's a suspicion that there's dyslexia. So I think what I would like to ask firstly is, Frances, being a former Senko, an art teacher, your experience within schools, what would be some signs to spot that a pupil in front of you may have dyslexia?
Yeah, it's a really important question. Going back to what you just said there about supporting people, I think this is why we're getting it so wrong, because you don't have to have a diagnosis, and the Equality Act says actually you don't need a diagnosis, whether you're a child or as an adult, to get support. And a lot of people, the way that our system is set up is through like this deficit lens, this deficit narrative, and the medical model that says, you know, to have a diagnosis means we're going to put support in place. Actually, what we're finding in England in particular is that lots of schools are getting themselves in trouble under the Public Duties Act because they're not putting things in place, and especially thinking about reasonable adjustments. So it's thinking about, if you feel that a child is struggling academically or not fulfilling their potential, and these are two different things as well, because what people will also say is that they're doing okay. They're not doing as brilliantly as they could be, but they're okay. They're not way behind, so we don't need to put things in place. That's wrong. We tend to wait until we're told to put something in place, because the medical model tells us that, okay, if a child has a diagnosis, then we can get support, we can get funding, but actually we're breaking the Equality Act and the Public Duties Act by not making reasonable adjustments. So even if a child in your class doesn't seem to be struggling too much, but they're not fulfilling their potential, this is the thing. This is why I'm a massive fan of baseline assessments, and not everybody else is. But unfortunately, we do get a lot of teacher bias, and we saw that when we had teacher assessed grades. And, you know, we have to use a mixture of things. So it's really important to say, okay, what is happening in terms of the progression that this child is making? Is it slowing down as the demands increase, and what does that look like? For me, my dyslexia is around auditory processing and short-term memory, and we miss that a lot. What does that look like for retention for a child? Are they able to follow instructions? You know, are they, you know, when we're putting demands on around phonics in, are they able to, you know, keep up with those demands? Those are the first kind of signs that we need to look at, especially with young people. And I think we really struggle to think about that, because we tend to think that dyslexia is around literacy. That's it. We don't think so much around the auditory processing and the memory issues as well.
Thank you for that, Frances. I think that's really important as well, that one size doesn't fit all, and I think that's what all needs within the classroom. The signs to spot dyslexia could be completely different in each and every individual learner, and it's wonderful to see your own personal experience with dyslexia and how you can understand that now, and you know how that works. And then hopefully after this session and after intervention within education, a lot more individuals can be that aware and that, you know, be able to put that forward within their workplace too. Shae, when we think about dyslexia, in my own experience of teaching, and I suppose I can only really praise the Scottish teaching system for that. As students, there was a lot of onus on learning about different needs and, you know, going into research and doing theses on it and understanding that fully. But that can be disparaging. I'm not sure if it's the same in New Zealand and Australia between different areas. For instance, it's very different, as Frances was saying, in England, Wales, Northern Ireland. But what really stands out to me is I don't think there's enough onus on communication. So learners with dyslexia and their communication, and how that might differ, not every single individual with dyslexia, but how a learner with dyslexia and their communication skills might differ from, say, a neurotypical learner. So would you be able to elaborate a little bit more on, if I was an educator within the classroom, what signs and differences in communication might a learner have with dyslexia than a neurotypical learner?
I think going back to Frances's point, it's more than just reading difficulties. So executive functioning really is a key challenge that we have. But if we're thinking about written communication skills, I mean, the first signs for me was in grade 2, and my handwriting wasn't as clear as other students. As I progressed, there were spelling mistakes in it, punctuation mistakes, And so I was put down as being lazy and careless. And when you're at a certain level, it seems to be that, particularly because of my dysgraphia as well, my writing started to drop. And so my sentence structure is quite poor. I tend to miss tenses. I don't put morphemes on the end, so I miss out on my E's and D's. I tend to write from the beginning. So for a student, you might see that they kind of start at the middle and they forget to put the beginning and the end or the context around it. And so I think those can be really important signs, particularly if they're doing really well academically in other areas, but it seems to be their reading and writing and maths as well can be areas that they're not as strong in, that's when we should be looking at what's happening for them.
Absolutely. No, thank you. Thank you so much for that. I do think that is really important for us to address and then move on, I suppose. And I always think about my eldest sister in this way. I remember just before my A-level maths exam, she was wanting to join the police force and they had an entry requirement that had to be writing and arithmetic. And I remember the night before my A-level maths exam, I was teaching my sister, who's 9 years older, fractions, how to add up fractions and things. And her level of anxiety surrounding that entry-level exam, even the interview itself, because her retention for longer questions, her ability to break that down logically, she really struggles with. And I think that her confidence was really impacted through that. And I know it's terrible to say, but then being a teacher and comparing my other sister's experience where her intervention was far earlier within her education and comparing their confidence levels, I think is really crucial, and it ties in with both of your works and both of your books really, really well. So I'd like to discuss the impact that dyslexia can have on a learner if there's inadequate support. So firstly, I would like to ask you, Frances, what do you feel like if we're thinking about an education sector, and I know, Shae, you could maybe start if we're thinking about adolescents, if there's inadequate support, what impact can that have on a personal development of a child in their adolescence?
You know, it's really interesting because we have this whole thing about play, and there was actually a report that was published by Ofsted of I think it was last year, that was criticizing play, saying that in some schools, a natural quote was, in some schools children play too much, their hands and feet are busy but their minds are not. And I remember reading this, and I probably quoted it slightly off, but that was the general gist of it. And I was just like, what on earth is this? Play is the most important thing, it's the foundation. And I used to be a speech and language advisory teacher for a local authority. And the amount of times that I used to have to say play is so important. And that's from birth, playing with our children, interacting with our children. When they get into school, the biggest area of need is speech and language. That doesn't change throughout, primary and secondary, but statistically, secondary, the biggest area of need is SEMH, social, emotional, mental health difficulties. Now, all that means is that a child, as they've struggled to catch up with their peers, you've recognized more expressive and receptive language difficulties that look like social, emotional, mental health difficulties. That has such a long-term impact on a child, young person's mental health, their self-esteem, their confidence, what that looks like for their trajectory for the rest of their life. Their ability to, be in long-term relationships, have a job, manage a budget and things like that is so important. And the example of your sister is spot on, because it affects our confidence. And if we're not confident enough to read, or we're not being shown how to read in a way that helps us, we're going to struggle to keep up with society. So I always say to people, think about speech and language first and foremost, which is why it's so great doing this discussion with Shae as well, with her specialism, because we tend to overlook how important play is and how important that speech and language is as well. So I definitely say those are the kind of things we need to look at first and foremost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, would you agree on that? This idea, it's quite scary to think about, isn't it? That inaccurate focus on the wrong thing in adolescence can have this snowball effect into their adulthood. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Shae, especially around that speech and language when they're younger?
Well, I mean, play is so important. I'm actually going to a conference in a couple of weeks, and it's all based around play. And, the way we learn to communicate as babies is that turn taking and that play between parents, and how we start to develop our vocabulary. So they're all really key milestones as we enter into primary school. And if we don't have that foundation, then we can really start to struggle. But I think there's a huge amount of research that indicates that if you've got dyslexia and in childhood, you tend to have low self-esteem, poor self-confidence, you start to identify that you're different to your peers, you're working harder, so it's taking you longer to complete activities. And so all these things start to build up. And as we get into secondary school, access to speech pathologists in Australia is really costly. And so all the time is spent in intervention as a child, which should be, but as we progress, we seem to see that drop off and it gets handed over to a tutor. And that intervention is so important because we see young people start to disengage from school. They start to, we see boys start to misbehave. We see girls that become quite withdrawn. And so there's a lot of research that talks about the difference between boys and girls as they transition into adolescence and the way that it can manifest as well. But at the end of the day, like Frances is saying, if we don't support that social and emotional wellbeing, the lifelong effects are huge, and that's what we're seeing in my research. And the educational trauma is significant. We hear a lot of the autistic community talking about medical trauma and the trauma with the medical system, but for us, I really feel it's that educational trauma, the way we're treated, the name calling, the way that teachers can treat us if they don't understand dyslexia, and it all has a ripple effect as we transition into adulthood.
And I suppose it's interesting in a way as well, because being secondary, I taught in an all-boys school. When we think about, I was in charge of, behaviour, attendance, attainment, all of it. And I think back to some of my pupils, and those pupils that, based off of your research, Shae, that high risk taking, because they're a learner with dyslexia, and their behaviour is essentially because they have an inadequate support for a learning need. And I think it's so easy, and we were talking about attendance earlier, to just sum it up. And it's awful to think that teachers turn around and say, oh, they're just bad, they're just lazy. And it really isn't. It's really an indication that they have a need that needs supported. And then hopefully later on in this session, we have tools and strategies that can do that. But that's really important. Shae, you shared an analogy earlier this week about the iceberg and how we see the effects of inadequate support with dyslexia, and at the top it is obviously that withdrawing, okay? And I think that is so important in terms of an analogy, because you have that massive section of the iceberg underneath. What other aspects of that iceberg essentially would an educator, if I was in a classroom, would I not necessarily be seeing that they might be expressing at home, or they might withdraw with themselves?
And I'm really happy to share the iceberg. It came out of our research, and it was really looking at, because we're working a lot harder than our peers to keep up with the task during the day, then we start to have an overlay of mental fatigue that can be really significant. Like, I have to have naps sometimes during the day because I'm so fatigued. And people don't see that mental fatigue and that cognitive overload that we can start to feel. So we might be really good in the morning. By lunchtime, we're starting to wear out. By the afternoon, we just can't function anymore because the environment's not being set up for us at the moment to have the tools we need to manage. And so the iceberg really talks about what that layering can look like. And the sensory, people don't talk as much about sensory overload for dyslexics. We hear a lot with the autistic community and ADHD, but we also face a lot of sensory challenges, particularly if there's a lot of noise. And so this starts to all play into us feeling really overwhelmed. And then that's when you can either see disengagement or just a sense of stress and anxiety happening for someone all the time.
And I suppose I'd like to put this question to both of you with your own experiences, I suppose. Does that sign of that, that struggle because your needs aren't getting met, that inadequate support, I suppose, does that change from when you're in school into adulthood? Will it evolve into something much worse that could be prevented?
You know what, it's interesting because as Shae was talking, I was thinking about a post that I wrote on LinkedIn this morning, and it took me probably about an hour and a half to write that post. And I know that even after I've written it, I'm going to go back and say, oh gosh, the grammar was wrong. Oh gosh, the spelling was wrong. Even though I've used grammar tools, I've checked it so many times, it's still going to be like that. That's what people don't see, or the preparation that goes into doing something that somebody else would find quite simple. And this is why technology is so important for us, because I can be, when I'm studying now, I can be in the classroom, and if the lecturer says something, I can quickly look it up and I can put it into like my own language so that I can understand that. I wish that I'd had those tools in school so that I'd know, okay, this is how my brain works. I'm not going to retain those kind of things. I'm not going to, the way that the lecturer said that word in my brain, that's going to, scramble that up and it's going to mess it up. And I need to just write down those keywords so I can look at that afterwards. So when I have keywords that I don't quite get, I write them down. And I look into them, I look at the morphology of the words, the roots of it and everything else, so that I can understand that. That takes so much more processing. So when Shae was saying about sleep, I'm like, oh my gosh, I need an afternoon nap. And it's so funny because we have seen in schools in England in particular, we're not doing so much creativity. We're not doing so much sport. We're so focused on like the ones that we see as more traditional academics like English, maths and science. We forget how important creativity, play and sport are for our brain. I am intentional as an art teacher to be creative, and the effect that has on me is just amazing, and especially exercise as well. I try and go to aquafit. There's something about being in the water in my brain. I try and do that at least 2-3 times a week. If I don't, then people know because my brain is just somehow, it just helps me connect and like resets me. These are the things we're not really teaching so much when children are young, the importance of these kind of things. And there's an author called TJ Power, and he calls it the dose effect. So it's really teaching us about dopamine, oxytocin, serotonin and endorphins. Why don't we talk about that in schools, and how that helps us into adulthood? I really don't understand, because as an adult, learning that has made such a difference to me, and being able to work flexibly, it's just helped me thrive. It really has. And I wish I'd had that in school.
And I suppose when we're thinking about you working closely with adults and learners with dyslexia, Shae, it's the exact same. We can advocate for workplaces and schools to be more inclusive and focus on learners with dyslexia and their strengths. But, we can't put the worlds to right in this 45-minute session, unfortunately. Do you feel like the effects of a person with dyslexia in the workplace can be more detrimental in a way? I like to think, Shae, of my sister, and she's applying for jobs in her interview. She always gets the interview, and then I'm sure she won't mind me saying this, she doesn't do very well at the interview just because she is so anxious, she's so tired from the prep. Do you feel like more needs done, in essence, in a workplace environment to kind of adhere to those needs?
Yes, and I think we really need to be supporting young people as they transition into adulthood to understand those challenges, because what we've seen through my research is there's challenges from recruitment all the way through to career progression. And the recruitment starts with, bias around how they advertise a job role. In Australia, you have to have a selection criteria for a lot of jobs, so that entails a lot of writing. My mum used to write all my selection criteria with me. So you need to have a CV, so it's very written based. And then you get into the interview and you're put on the spot, and we don't always process or understand the question properly, and then getting the answer out coherently, because our verbal expression can start to be impacted if we're under stress. So all of those factors can impact how we do in an interview. And also we see there's a lot of aptitude tests and other types of psychometric testing as well, and they time out, so you don't have enough time to read the question to then answer it. We've had people ask for adjustments in an interview for a computer that has spell check as an example. They've not been allowed to have it. They've been told just do your best. So there's definitely barriers from leaving school and going into TAFE. We have TAFE over here, or higher education, and into the workplace when there's not that support. And I think also just understanding that it's very rare just to have dyslexia. Like most of the time someone will have dysgraphia, ADHD, autism. So there's multiple co-occurring differences that we need to be looking at in the education sector all the way through into the workplace.
I agree entirely. It's an interesting thought when you think that, the bare minimum I think schools do provide for students who do these assessments and they require extra time, they're used to that for the 5-6 years they're in school, excuse me. But then when it comes to the workplace, that support is taken away. So I suppose it's really important now to think about, we're mentioning about extra time and different ways a workplace can help those that are perhaps dyslexic and to meeting those requirements. I think it's really important for us now to think about, as an educator, what are some tools and strategies that we can put in place into the classroom that can help support those learners. We want to go through some non-tech approaches that we can do in the classroom. What I think is really important is, I'm quite logical. I like to think, okay, if I had a to-do list of learners, all learners, especially learners with dyslexia, what are some non-tech approaches that I can do as soon as they're in front of my door in the classroom to help meet those needs and promote inclusion? So I'd like to address both of you. Shae, if you would like to go first. If I was an educator, even before they sit down, what are some things I can do to help meet their needs?
I think first and foremost, teachers need to be educated about dyslexia and neurodivergence, because I think particularly in Australia, we see that there's a significant lack of understanding in secondary schools around dyslexia, the prevalence rates, what it means to have dyslexia, the co-occurring mental health challenges. So teachers need to be educated around just what we're talking about tonight and your day, because I think if you don't understand the different types of students coming into your classroom, then it's going to be really challenging when you start to develop your curriculum or your class material, because you're not going to be able to support the broad range of needs that are in the classroom. I also think that supporting parents as well is really important, and looking at that strength-based approach for everyone as they're coming through the classroom. And as we'll discuss, those universal design principles, where there's a lot of tools and strategies that are actually going to enable everyone in the classroom to thrive, not just those with dyslexia.
I agree. I completely agree. I suppose we meet them at the door, and there's some things in our practice that we know to do from our training. So we know that they might need additional time just to review instruction. We know to break down those instructions, sensory aids and things work. But we already do things that I think that every teacher listening to this session already does, and that is an inclusive environment, an encouraging environment. It's awful to say that perhaps there are some teachers that we've perhaps had experience in the past. I know my sister was labelled as lazy when she was going through secondary school and she was struggling with understanding her own needs. But I feel like, in my own opinion, in the schools I've worked with, we are becoming far more encouraging, far more praising, far more inclusive. Is there any other strategies within the classroom, Frances, even if we think about instructions or tasks or lesson lengths, task lengths, that teachers can do in order to meet the needs of a learner with dyslexia?
It's really funny because as you were talking, it has been really, really sunny here, and now it has started pouring it down with rain. If I'd gone out earlier, I would have just gone out in like a nice summer dress, whatever. Now I'm like, okay, I need an umbrella, I need a raincoat, I need everything else. To me, it's exactly the same in education. You prepare for all types of weather, and all types of learner. You don't say afterwards, oh, I should have got an umbrella with me today. You check the weather, you take one out with you. As a teacher, we have to be able to be given the time to get to know our learners. That's the most important thing. I always say to people that relationship is fundamental. And what we're seeing more and more is teachers are not given the time to build that relationship. And it's the number one thing that works. What do your learners need? If you were planning to go out today, what do you need to go out today? What do you need for the classroom for each and every individual? And are you given the time to put that in place? Unfortunately for educators, it's not. Yes, unfortunately, you still get educators, schools, local authorities that do not believe in dyslexia. And this is the thing that we had a discussion about when we were doing the Jamie Oliver documentary, is sometimes you're up against systems that don't believe in dyslexia. And you kind of have to fight against this. And when you said before about we can't change the world in this 45-minute session, I've got ADHD, so naturally I believe I can change the world as soon as I say, right, it needs to be changed. But it's so important just to think, okay, sometimes despite what people are telling me, what do I need to put in place? Just making sure that you're thinking about working memory first and foremost, because that is part of every single type of neurodivergence. It's actually a really good working memory rating scale by Alloway and Gathercall, because I have a visual memory. I'm thinking, right, okay, it's a purple cover with an elephant on it, and it helps you to look at assessments in the classroom that you can use to help people with their working memory. Just making sure you've got visuals, keywords, and questioning, not always expecting people to write things down, those alternative ways of recording. You can put that in place for everyone, like Shae was saying before, that universal design that helps everybody, even children or young people that you don't think it will help, all of a sudden everyone's benefiting from it. And that's the great thing about universal design for learning, is everybody benefits from it, and I think it's really important fundamentally to put those things in place.
Yeah, and I suppose what we're thinking, oh, sorry, Shae, go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to add, I think being curious about your students, like if they're doing really well in a lot of areas and for some reason they don't want to get up and read, or they don't want to write in front of people, or you notice that they're excusing themselves every time they're asked a question, why is the student doing that, and is there something going on that you may not know about, and they might not even know, and being curious about what's happening to that individual.
And I think what's a really good note there too is that dyslexia looks different depending on any individual. I remember back to certain classes, I think one of my pupils, his problem solving was fantastic, but he was very narrative in it, and that is fantastic in English. So he would narrate or summarize for the rest of the class, and that gained his confidence. But a pupil 2 seats away lacked that confidence, and they perhaps needed strength, which is their visual aid, they're able to put things together visually lovely. He would have a storyboard and he would be doing that quietly to revise what we've just done in a novel. And I think that is super important. Being curious, we have this universal design that it has to apply to all learners. And I think this is where we need to have this shift. How do we shift away as dyslexia as a barrier to dyslexia as a learning need that has certain strengths? And we were speaking earlier, it's fine for us to tell an educator, as a teacher, this is what you can do, X, Y, Z in a classroom, but it really has to be a whole school approach, doesn't it? Do you both agree with that statement?
Yeah, definitely. And like I said, unfortunately, you still have people who are at that strategic level that don't believe in dyslexia. And that's the immediate barrier, because if they're saying, right, we don't believe in it, then it's harder for individual teachers to put things in place. So I think we really need that kind of universal support to say this is what we're doing for every single child, and seeing their needs is just as important as somebody else's.
Absolutely. And I think what's interesting is in schools, you might have a literacy coordinator or a numeracy coordinator, and we're about to talk about tech. And I do think that tech champions have a real role within a school, but it's like any huge school difference, isn't it? This big change in a school, you need somebody who's championing that, who's well trained, knowledgeable in that area. We obviously have wonderful Senkos, but do they have the time to educate and put in big differences in schools when they've got a huge to-do list? They just don't. And I suppose this is why I'm going to go on to tech approaches. We've looked at pedagogy, we've looked at strategies that do work, but we really are advancing in technology. And I suppose that's why I left the teaching profession really in the first place, was because I saw the difference that technology could do with learners, and it felt far more rewarding, and it felt exciting to be able to bring that difference to different learners with tech. So that brings us on to a slide here, which is digital tools. How can, and I'm going to direct the question to you first, Frances, how can digital tools improve accessibility and inclusion within a school, do you think?
Well, I'm sitting here at my desk. I've got my laptop, which is touch type. Is really, I can touch the screen on it. I've got my phone that I've got my notes on, and then I've got 2 screens in the background. Tech is revolutionary for me, and there's a saying, IBM, that says tech makes things possible. And it's so true. It's such an old saying, but it's true, because without that technology, I would really, really struggle, and it's so important to think, with all the advances in assistive technology and AI, those are the two things that now is such an important time for us to be thinking how we embed that into the classroom. But unfortunately, like you said, in our schools, if we don't have the technology, not only the expertise, if we don't have the Wi-Fi that's good enough, to be able to carry these systems, then we're in trouble. We need that technology, and we need a massive investment in technology as well. So I would say, especially for special needs coordinators, we need training for our Senkos to be able to use the technology, to be able to recommend it. I'm an assistive technology trainer, so when I speak to university students, I can say, okay, these are the things that you're struggling with. I recommend using this, and that. It should be exactly the same for, pre-16 as well, where a Senko has the time to go into the classroom, do an observation, do an assessment to say, these are the adjustments that you need, these are the technologies that can help, and actually we're going to supply those technologies. It shouldn't be that one school can, give a laptop or give a tablet or something else like that, and another school can't do that. And, we really need to look at that equity around that.
I agree. And I suppose when we're thinking about different tools as well, I suppose that's why Read and Write for me from Everway was so appealing, because I had English and additional language learners, I had students who had autism, ADHD, learners with dyslexia. The amount of tools that could work without any Wi-Fi, I was just so shocked that I'd gone 4 years without knowing technology like that existed, just because of what high impact it really had.
Yeah.
We are used to throwing out a coloured overlay to a student and being like, here, see if that works. And that was unfortunately what it was like in my first year of teaching. I thought I ticked the box, I'd met their needs. And now we can see that that doesn't meet every learner's needs. And having an array of tools is so important, especially when we think about tools like text to speech. So Shae, when we're thinking about text to speech, why might some learners with dyslexia really benefit from that?
Well, I can't live without text to speech and speech to text. So I dictate everything, and even though it sometimes comes out wrong, I can pick those smaller mistakes up, apart from inviting my family over for dinner once that was completely inappropriate accidentally. I didn't said that there were no nipples included in the dinner, and I meant nibbles. So sometimes text to speech can trip us up, especially if we don't proofread, because I probably would have picked that up. But and also being able to listen to what we've written can really help with our proofreading. For me, I can hear the mistakes in my writing, I can't see them. And tech is a game changer for those with dyslexia. It has changed my life. I'm able to work independently. I don't need someone to check my work anymore like I used to. Unless it's really, really important, I'll get my auntie to proofread it. But being able to have those tools has changed my life. But it does come back to access as well. And if a child doesn't have a computer, we can talk about all the digital tools, or if they don't have access to internet when they go home, then that can be a real challenge. And so we're disadvantaging dyslexic students again if they don't get access to these tools. And in Australia, we're seeing at the moment, particularly in universities, that it's starting to be looked at as cheating, accessing some of these tools, rather than seeing it as an advantage to really let students shine when they've got the right, like being able to dictate when you're not asking people over for nipples. There's huge advantages that I would not have been able to write a book or do my thesis without some of these tools. They've just been life-changing.
Absolutely. And I suppose what you're saying there is exam board and schools and things are looking at technology almost dubiously. There's a mistrust there that there wouldn't be, if a new pedagogy was approached within a classroom base, that every single learner with dyslexia has to have a blue overlay. There would be no distrust, and it's just the same. And I feel like we are doing learners a disservice here, where we talk about all of these curriculums come out with new paperwork on creating happy learners, independent learners. Mental health crisis is at an all-time high, for instance, for teenage boys. And they're not independent learners either. We're finding that in schools, they're having to be spoon-fed more and more. Everything's more of a memory game, like we discussed previously. If we have tools such as Everways Read and Write, where it can be offline, we've got the Check It tool that allows with them to understand your writing style and check if that would be something that would be resonant with the way they write. You've got the overlays, the text-to-speech, the speech-to-text. If they have all of that at their fingertips, they are becoming more independent learners. And we were thinking about the impacts of individuals with dyslexia that don't get the support they need, such as low confidence, poor mental health, mental fatigue. These digital tools can help alleviate these issues, but it has to be on a whole school front, on a curriculum front, in order for those changes to be made, which can be frustrating. But I think that's why you need to have someone within the school who's willing to be that champion, willing to really push these points and say, look, the data doesn't lie, this works, let's just give it a chance, I think. And I think that...
And I think
Sorry,
it's really hard to have that. It's really hard to have that champion. We see it in the workplace as well. Like if you don't have that champion, then it all falls apart. And it really comes back to what Frances was saying before. You know, you need the strategy, you need the agreement at that executive level, whether it's at a school, whether it's at the regional level or in the workplace, you know, it's at that cultural level. If you don't have the top people agreeing, then all these tools just fall away. And so we really need the decision makers, not just the champions, really getting in there and saying, yes, these tools are valuable and students should have access to them.
Yeah. And also you need more neurodivergent people, educators who are able to talk about their own needs. You know, how amazing is it to have a teacher with dyslexia that speaks to the class about their dyslexia and the tools that help them. You know, those are the champions in your school, and it's about making people feel accepted and that they're bringing all these strengths to your school to support your learners. So important.
Yeah, I do
We
think
could have
that
a
is
whole
key.
conversation.
Yeah.
Sorry, so we could have a whole different conversation around disclosure, couldn't we? And
we're just trying to solve all the issues in the world in this session today, ladies. So I suppose that brings us to our concluding and final thoughts. We've kind of already touched upon the process of this barrier to inclusion. It's definitely from the top down, and I, being in education for 8 years, I completely agree. But that doesn't mean that there aren't different strategies and tools an educator can do within their classroom in order to meet the needs of a learner with dyslexia. So thank you so much for your insights today, ladies. Before we leave, the final question that I'll have, I've been harassing you for 45 minutes. Shae, what would be your number one piece of advice as an educator for supporting a learner with dyslexia?
Dyslexia is not linked to intelligence. We're highly intelligent people, students, and really with the right tools, and particularly digital tools, we can thrive and we can reach our full potential. And at the moment, that's been overlooked. And so I think every student has potential, and dyslexic students just need a little bit more support to bring that out.
I agree. Frances, I'll direct the question to you. Your number one piece of advice, and it can't be about intelligence because I think Shae summed that up wonderfully.
Oh, sorry, Frances, was that yours too?
No, I wrote down one succinct sentence because I realized since I've been diagnosed with dyslexia, I write so much. You know, it's the same when children have speech and language support, then all of a sudden they're always talking. So I wrote one sentence to keep it succinct. So I said about whole school literacy improvements through dyslexia-friendly practices. If you're improving things for children with dyslexia, you improve things for everyone. And my number one advice, listen to learners and their experiences to guide effective support. So important. So that's my final thought.
That was like a mic drop moment from you all. Thank you so much for your time. I've honestly loved this session. And thanks again. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the conference.
Bye.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this session on dyslexia. To hear more about our tools in action, be sure to check the agenda to see what time our demos are live. Thank you.